sure about a sentence. I think perhaps the single most convincing fact, the observation that you could point to, would be the pattern of resemblances that you see when you compare the genes using modern DNA techniques, actually looking at the letter-to-letter correspondences between genes. Compare the genes of any pair of animals you like, pair of animals, pair of plants, and then plot out the resemblances, and they fall in a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family tree. And the only alternative to it being a family tree is that the intelligent designer deliberately set out to deceive us in the most underhand and devious manner.
One of the major arguments for common descent in general, which they'll look to the so-called geologic column, and they'll look to the lower layers, followed by the middle to the top, and say we got a series of common descent here. But in the world of genetics and molecular genetics, you as a molecular biologist, they'll say, well, these similar proteins, and you'll see people like Richard Dawkins make this argument too, that similar DNA, similar proteins that we find in basically the entirety of the biological world, the fact that they fall out into nested hierarchical patterns, more similarity in proteins and DNA between humans and chimps than between humans and dogs or humans and fish. They'll say that suggests strongly common descent. And I'm curious, Joel, how you feel. Obviously, we have many different ways we could approach that as creationists, but how do you feel is the best way to approach that argument?
Yeah, okay. So I would like to pose the question, if you were designing it, how would you design it? And initially, I used to think that, well, a designer could have designed them to be like completely independent organisms with no shared sequence between them. The designer is not constrained to have designed that shared sequence between those two. But that's not true, actually. As I realized this going through my PhD work, why would God create in kind of a nested hierarchy? Because we do see that in creation. We are biologically speaking mammalian. Why would God create us to be mammalian and have all these shared similarities? And then it hit me one day. Okay, the reason why you have these shared similarities from a design perspective, well, number one, it's good design, so you reuse the design. But no, this is that's kind of old hat. This is what I realized. It's so that you can study a fruit fly to learn about Alzheimer's disease. You can study a mouse to learn about neural tube closure. You can study a yeast to learn about cancer. And so the reason you can study a monkey to learn about human viruses. The reason you would create nested hierarchy is because in a world where you want the humans, your people created in your image, to be able to understand and study the world, you have to build a platform of similarities between the other life forms out there.
That right there is an incredible answer, and I appreciate it, Joel, because it adds another level or degree to how we typically respond, that human engineers build in hierarchical patterns, and so why wouldn't God build hierarchically? But it adds another layer to that. It's a four-dimensional answer, because yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you really think about it. The fact that we can study monkeys, mice, fruit flies, and we can learn more about disease, we can develop various sophisticated mechanisms and health treatments and so on, and learn about viruses, like you said. So basically, if we didn't have those similarities, or those nested hierarchical patterns in the biological world didn't exist in genetics, we couldn't carry out those kinds of research projects.
Yeah, imagine, for instance, what's the only way you could learn about humans if we bore no similarity to other life forms?
By testing fellow humans.
Yeah, exactly. Does that sound like a good creation?
No, that sounds scary. That's, yeah, which right there is a great answer. So to this whole nested hierarchy argument, which many evolutionary biologists, like, again, Richard Dawkins, there's a video out there called "One Fact to Refute Creationism." And I always love when they say creationism and not evolutionism, but Richard Dawkins' answer is that the fact that we have all these DNA similarities in the biological world that followed into hierarchical patterns. But the answer you just provided demonstrates that a good designer would design this way for many good reasons.
Yeah, and let me give a shout out. Like, this is one of those like outstanding questions for creation biologists, is to understand the extent of true uh, of true similarities due to common descent, because there is some, dogs, wolves, coyotes related by common descent, and to understand the limitations. So I recommend, if you are a biologist out there, definitely get involved with the Creation Research Society, because there are a lot of people that are trying to answer these questions from a biblical perspective, understanding where those lines of demarcation are within the hierarchy.
And it's fun for us as creationists, Joel, because we can explain the similarities due to common design and due to the necessity for research, like you said, medicines, viruses, so on and so forth. But we can also explain the differences. So I like to say it's the differences that make all the difference, because in those research projects that you're talking about, which we need to be active in, we can look to these genetic level discontinuities that we as a creationist would expect, that separates kinds, that the evolutionist can't really explain because the differences are too massive. And I think that's a good way to approach that field.
Yeah, well put. Can I borrow that? The differences in the differences?
There you go. The differences are in the differences, which we could talk about all day. Orphan genes, Y chromosome dissimilarity between humans and chimps. And we can explain that. We can explain both. Yeah. But the evolutionists, they can explain similarities and some differences. But if the differences are too massive, that's where I think they have the biggest challenge. Sam,
collagen is a great example of that, because we see collagen, it's a great design, and it's used modularity throughout vertebrates, so it's used widespread. But then there is no equivalent in lower life forms, so it just pops out of nowhere. That's very hard to explain from a gradualistic evolutionary perspective. Whereas, like you point out, from a created perspective, we can explain the similarities and the novelties from a designer.
That's right. So you're saying the collagen, kind of like a Cambrian explosion,
yes.
Permian.
Yep.
Wow. So it pops up, no precursors, no pre-collagen, basically.
There are many types of collagen. Collagen type 1, type 2, type 1A, type 2A. So there's a huge family of collagen in invertebrates, but there's no precursor to that.
Wow. That's incredible. Sam, did you have a follow-up, brother?
Yeah, just regarding the Dawkins question, I think that there's also theological reasons why, because God clearly created a world where that glorifies God and is evident everywhere. But at the same time, He created a world where people can suppress that truth and believe a lie. And I think that's what we see in this debate, because when someone alters their worldview, like we were talking about, then evidence of design is everywhere. And evidence of God is everywhere also. But as long as people are unwilling to believe and see it, well, then there's plenty out there for them to suppress that truth also.
Yeah, I guess it gives them enough reason to swallow the common descent pill. And, I also find it funny on the nested hierarchy argument. This is just a basic point, but it's not really a surprise that we share more in terms of genetics, Joel, with a chimp than we do with a banana plant. I mean, you could just stand afar, look at a human, a chimp, and a banana plant, and you could probably make that prediction ahead of time. We look more like a chimp. Anyways.
Yeah, it turns out our genes do have something to do with our appearance.
Right. Exactly. Yes.